I was 15 years old, standing on the sidewalk in a soaking wet hoodie while the coldest rain I'd ever felt turned into a literal hailstorm, all because my stepmother decided that her daughter's lie was more important than my life. I remember looking up at the darkened windows of the house I'd lived in since I was 5 and realizing that the woman I called Mom for a decade would actually rather see me freeze than admit her biological daughter was a thief. It's been 10 years since that night, and let me tell you, get out is a very dangerous thing to say to someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose. Before I get into how I ended up owning the very ground she walks on, and how I systematically dismantled the comfortable life she stole from my father, I have to ask you something honestly. If you were a teenager with no money, no phone, and nowhere to go in the middle of a literal natural disaster, would you ever forgive the person who pushed you out the door? Or would you spend every waking second of the next decade making sure they felt every bit of the cold they forced on you? My dad was a good man, a real self-made success story who started with a single truck and built a construction empire that defined our city's skyline. He was my hero, but he was also a man who worked 60 nowadays to ensure I never had to want for anything. When my biological mother passed away when I was just a toddler, it was just the two of us for a long time. I remember those early years as being full of sawdust, blueprint sketches, and the smell of diesel and old coffee. But a man like that gets lonely, and when I was 7, Sandra entered the picture. At first, she was a dream. She'd bake cookies, ask me about my day, and bring her daughter, Chloe, over for playdates. Chloe was just a year younger than me, and I initially thought of her as the sister I never had. We'd play in the backyard of the massive estate my dad had just finished building for us, a place with high ceilings and wide hallways that felt like a fortress. But once the ring was on Sandra's finger, the fortress started to feel like a prison. The transformation was subtle, like a slow-acting poison. Sandra didn't turn into a villain overnight. She just slowly eroded my place in the house until I was more like a live-in ghost than a son. It started with small things, like my things being moved from the large second floor bedroom to the smaller room over the garage so Chloe could have a hobby room for her dolls and eventually her makeup. Then, my dad's attention was constantly redirected toward Chloe's anxiety, or her needs, every time I had an achievement at school. If I won a track meet, Chloe suddenly had a panic attack that required everyone's full attention. If I got an A on a difficult project, Sandra would spend the entire dinner talking about how Chloe needed a private tutor because the school system was failing her. My dad, bless his heart, was so tired from work and eventually so sick from his heart condition that he just wanted peace. He didn't see the manipulation. He just saw a wife who was passionate about her daughter. The real trouble started when my dad's health began to decline rapidly. He developed a heart condition that sidelined him from the business he loved, and suddenly the house felt very small. Sandra took over the finances to help him out, claiming he needed to focus on his recovery, and that was the beginning of the end. She started cutting my allowance, claiming we needed to save for medical bills, while simultaneously buying Chloe designer bags and a new horse for her weekend riding lessons. By the time I was 15, my dad was spending more time in the hospital than at home, hooked up to machines that hummed and beeped, leaving me alone in that big, cold house with two people who clearly wished I didn't exist. One Friday night, while Dad was admitted for observation after a particularly scary chest pain episode, I found Chloe in my room. She wasn't just there. She was going through my desk with a level of entitlement that made my blood boil. I had been saving every cent I made from mowing lawns, tutoring younger kids, and cleaning gutters to buy a car when I turned 16. I had about $1,200 hidden in an old shoebox, the kind of money that represents hundreds of hours of sweat and blistered hands. When I walked in, she had the box open and was stuffing the bills into her pocket, looking at a mirror as if she were trying on a new outfit. When I confronted her, she didn't apologize or look ashamed. She just looked at me with this chillingly blank expression and said, "Mom said you don't need this much money anyway, since you'll probably just spend it on something stupid. I need a new camera for my social media." I tried to grab the box back, and that's when she went into full performance mode. She didn't just scream, she shrieked like I was physically assaulting her. She threw the shoe box across the room, scattering the remaining bills, and started tearing at her own hair. Sandra came charging down the stairs like she had been waiting for the cue, and before I could even get a word out to explain the theft, Chloe threw herself onto the floor. She sobbed about how I had pushed her against the wall and tried to steal her birthday money that she'd saved up. It was a total fabrication, a complete reversal of the truth so audacious it left me speechless. Sandra didn't even look at the evidence or ask for my side. She just helped Chloe up, coddling her like she'd just survived a war zone, and told me to give her the box and the rest of the money. I refused, obviously. I told her it was my money, my hard work, and that Chloe was a liar. That's when the weather outside decided to match the mood in the room. The wind was howling, rattling the heavy glass panes of the front door, and the local news on the kitchen TV was flashing bright red alerts about a severe weather cell moving in. A once-in-a-decade storm. Sandra's face went pale with a different kind of rage. The kind of rage that comes when someone finally stands up to a bully. She told me that if I was going to be a thief, a liar, and a bully, I wasn't welcome under her roof. She said she couldn't have a violent element near her daughter while my father wasn't there to restrain me. She told me to get out, and stay out until I learned how to be a part of a family. I thought she was joking. I thought there was no way a grown woman would throw a 15-year-old out into a storm with 60-mile-per-hour winds and freezing rain. But then she grabbed me by the arm, her nails digging into my skin, dragged me to the front door, and literally shoved me out onto the porch. I stood there for a minute, the rain instantly soaking through my clothes, thinking she'd open the door once she realized how bad the weather was. But then I heard the heavy thud of the deadbolt clicking into place. I knocked until my knuckles bled. I yelled until my throat was raw. I even apologized for things I didn't even do, begging just to sit in the garage until the storm passed. But the lights in the hallway just went out, one by one. I spent that night huddled under the crawl space of a neighbor's shed, shivering so hard I thought my teeth would shatter, listening to the hail dent the metal roof above me. It was the longest, coldest, and most lonely 12 hours of my life. I was lucky a neighbor, Mr. Henderson, saw me the next morning while checking his property for damage. He found a blue, shaking kid and took me in, wrapped me in blankets, and eventually called my aunt, my dad's sister, Sarah, who lived 3 states away. When my aunt called the house in a panic, Sandra didn't even skip a beat. She told Sarah that I had run away in a fit of rage after being caught stealing from them, and that she had spent the whole night looking for me. It was a lie so layered and reinforced that by the time my dad got out of the hospital a week later, the narrative was set in stone. I was the troubled kid who had abandoned the family in their time of need. Sandra had even managed to convince my father, in his weakened and confused state, that I'd stolen thousands from Chloe. I never got to see my dad again to tell him the truth. Sandra blocked my aunt's calls and moved my dad to a private care facility where unauthorized visitors weren't allowed. He passed away from a massive stroke 2 months later. Because Sandra had power of attorney and a freshly updated will that I am certain to this day was forged or signed under duress, she inherited everything. The house, the construction empire, the retirement accounts, the cars, everything my father had bled for. I was left with nothing but the clothes on my back and a grudge that felt like a burning coal in my chest, kept hot by the memory of that frozen night in the shed. So here I was, an orphan at 15, living with an aunt who barely knew me and lived on a fixed income, while the woman who threw me out like trash was living in luxury on my father's dime. I had to make a choice right then, staring out the window of my aunt's cramped guest room. I could be a victim for the rest of my life, or I could become a hunter. I decided to wait. I decided to play the long game, a game that would span years and require every ounce of my discipline. I went to school and worked 3 jobs simultaneously: busboy, tutor, and construction site cleaner. I studied the construction industry like it was my religion. I wanted to understand the logistics, the legalities, the bidding processes, and the debt structures. I wanted to know exactly how my father had built his empire so I could eventually take it back, piece by piece. But before I tell you how I walked back into that house 10 years later and watched the look of pure terror cross Sandra's face as she realized she was finished, I want you to stop. Think about that 15-year-old kid shivering in the mud while his father lay dying in a hospital, surrounded by lies. Think about the level of betrayal it takes to leave a child in a storm. I want you to pause right now and comment below. What would your first move be? Would you try to reach out and fix the relationship for the sake of your father's memory? Or would you burn the whole bridge down and salt the earth behind you? I really want to know if I'm the only one who thinks that some things are just unforgivable, no matter how much time passes. The next decade was a blur of calculated obsession. I didn't just want to be successful. I wanted to be the specific kind of successful that would haunt Sandra's nightmares. I got my degree in civil engineering, graduating at the top of my class while working night shifts at a firm that competed directly with my father's old company. By the time I was 25, I had started my own consultancy firm, specialized in distressed asset acquisition and urban development. I was good at it, viciously good, because I wasn't just working for money. I was working for a reckoning. All the while, I kept tabs on my father's old company, which Sandra had been managing through a series of increasingly incompetent boyfriends and cronies who knew more about expensive watches than they did about structural integrity. She didn't know the first thing about the business. She treated it like a personal ATM, draining the assets to fund luxury vacations, designer wardrobes, and Chloe's failed attempts at becoming a high-end socialite. By year 9, the company was hemorrhaging money. They were over-leveraged on bad land deals, behind on federal taxes, and desperate for a buy-out just to stay out of prison for fraud. That's when I made my move. I didn't use my real last name. I had legally changed it to my mother's maiden name years prior, scrubbed from any record Sandra might recognize. I approached her through a shell corporation, a sleek, faceless entity offering a lifeline merger that was actually a predatory acquisition designed to strip her of every protection she had left. The day of the signing was the first time I'd seen her since that night in the storm. The meeting took place in the very boardroom my father had built, a room that still smelled faintly of the expensive cigars he used to favor. She looked older, stressed, her skin tightened by too many cosmetic surgeries, and draped in cheap, flashy jewelry that screamed desperate, to anyone who knew what real wealth looked like. Chloe was there too, looking like a carbon copy of her mother, bored and scrolling through her phone, complaining about the lack of good lighting in the office. They had no idea who I was. I sat across the table from them in a tailored charcoal suit, the CEO of the holding company. We went through the paperwork, and she was so eager to get the money to pay off her creditors that she barely read the clauses. As soon as she signed the final document, the one that transferred the deed of the family home, the office building, and the remaining company assets to my firm, I leaned back in my father's old leather chair and smiled. I told her, the last time we spoke, it was raining much harder than this. The confusion on her face was a masterpiece of slow motion realization. I watched the blood drain from her cheeks as she looked at my eyes. finally recognizing the boy she had shoved into the night 10 years ago. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out that old, beat-up shoebox, the one Chloe had tried to steal from, and set it on the mahogany table. It looked so small and pathetic in that grand room, but it felt like a mountain. I reached inside and pulled out a single, crumpled $10 bill. I pushed it across the table toward her and said, "That's for the night I spent in the shed. And since I now own this building, the house you're living in, and the car you drove here in, I'm giving you exactly 1 hour to vacate my property before I have you arrested for trespassing." Chloe started screaming, just like she did when we were kids, a shrill, entitled sound that used to make me tremble. But this time I didn't flinch. I just looked at her with pity. I had security standing by the door. I watched them get escorted out into a drizzly Tuesday afternoon, their designer heels clicking frantically on the pavement as they realized they had nowhere to go. It wasn't a hailstorm, but for them, it was the end of the world. The aftermath was glorious in its cold, methodical finality. I didn't just take the money and the property. I spent the next 6 months auditing every single transaction from the last 10 years. I found exactly what I expected: the proof of the forged signatures on my father's final will and the systematic embezzlement Sandra had used to fund Chloe's influencer lifestyle. I didn't even have to do much. I just handed a neatly organized box of evidence to the district attorney and let the legal system finish what the storm started. Sandra lost everything in the subsequent lawsuits and criminal charges. She's currently living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, working a retail job she hates just to pay back the restitution she owes. Chloe, unable to handle a life without a silver spoon, has disappeared into a cycle of bad debt and burnt bridges. Her followers are long gone now that the glamour has faded. I moved back into my father's house just long enough to renovate it, stripping away every trace of Sandra's gaudy influence, and then I sold it to a young family with 3 kids who actually deserved a home filled with love. I didn't want the ghosts, I just wanted the justice. Looking back, that 15-year-old kid in the rain would never have believed where he'd end up. I learned that the world doesn't give you what you deserve, it gives you what you take. Sandra thought that by saying "get out," she was getting rid of a problem. She never realized she was actually creating the architect of her own downfall. She taught me that survival is the best form of revenge, but total ownership is a very close second. If there's a moral here, it's that you should be very careful who you throw away, because they might just come back and buy the trash can you're standing in. If you think I went too far, or if you think I did exactly what needed to be done to honor my father's memory, let me know. Like this video if you were on my side and think Sandra got what was coming to her. Subscribe for more stories of justice and long-term revenge, because I have plenty more to share from the world of people who thought they could get away with it. Share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Did the punishment fit the crime? I'll see you all in the next story.